This is my timeline of special education. Before 1931, many schools were specialized for children that had disabilities such as blindness, hearing loss, or mental retardation, which is the term they used back then. So I started my timeline in 1931 with the Department of Special Education being formed. While some progress was made in the special ed department, special education took a backseat to World War II and to the Great Depression. So it wasn't really until the 1954 court case of Brown versus the Board of Education that parents, in that case, it was ruled that racial segregation was unconstitutional. And after that ruling, parents with disabled children started to sue their local schools, saying that their children should not be excluded or segregated because of a disability. In 1965, President Johnson signed into act the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, providing funds for schools to have a proper environment for children with disabilities. In 1966, Congress amended it to establish a grant program for the education of handicapped children. In 1973, the first disability civil rights law was enacted in the United States, with Section 504 prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities. And I went through trying to find pictures. I should have talked about that sooner, of these periods in time. And they were in black and white, and I decided to continue even when the pictures turned to color. I changed them to black and white to keep a consistency, and I think sometimes it makes the image more powerful. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed, guaranteeing free appropriate public education for all children with disabilities. This law was in response to two groups of children, which I did not know, but upon research I found out that the first group it was in response to was the more than 1 million children with disabilities who had been excluded entirely from education. Thinking about 1 million children in the United States now being excluded from education is almost hard to fathom. So I found that really interesting. And then the second group that this law was in response to was a group of more than half of all children living with disabilities in the early 1970s. More than half, okay, let me restate that. More than half of the children living with disabilities in the 1970s formed the second group. And then it said this law had a positive impact on millions of children, obviously, after you learn who the law was in response to. In 1986, amendments were made to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act to mandate preschool programming to serve children ages 3 to 5 and to have a grant program for infants and toddlers from birth through age 2. This provided intervention services for families with young children with disabilities. In 1990, I should have stated that Ronald Reagan signed that into law in 1986. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and this stated that children with disability should or are to be provided a free, appropriate public education that is tailored to their individual needs. So if I'm understanding this right, up until this point, the education may not have been specifically tailored to each child. What I also learned is that this idea was actually previously known as the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, and it was that name from 1975 to 1990, where it got renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which is what we still, I think, know it as today. In 2004, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized, increasing the focus on accountability and improved outcomes by emphasizing reading, early intervention, and research-based instruction by requiring special ed teachers be highly qualified. What I learned also about this is that the reauthorization emphasized the need to align IDEA with other school improvement efforts. So basically, children with disabilities should be held to a high standard, just as those that are non-disabled, and they should have established goals, just like the standards that are set for non-disabled children. In 2010, President Obama put into effect Rose's Law, and that law changed the term mental retardation to intellectual disability. I think that's fabulous. Bingo. So I found this graphic of special education and all of the different words, I'm sure there are more, encompass the complexity, I think, that is special education. It's my hope that inclusion will be used as much as possible in the future. I read some articles that stated that inclusion is good. Inclusion benefits both the student with the disability and the students that are not disabled, that it provides good social learning for not only the disabled student but also the non-disabled student. I also read articles where some people thought that inclusion might be a goal to minimize cost for special education, and I hope that is not the goal of inclusion, a cost-cutting method. I don't believe it is, but I would be interested in your thoughts on that. And then I also read that most schools are trying to get to 100% inclusion, but a lot of researchers think that that might be impossible, and it just might not be possible, or it might not be good or beneficial for all students. to have full inclusion. So I think in the future that's going to be probably debated more and hopefully researched more. But I think that we're headed in the right direction. It's also my hope that funding does not get cut. It seems like it's always at the forefront, I guess, of the topics of education as funding cuts, and special education is right there. So it's my hope that that does not happen. And finally, I hope that more students would consider majoring in special education. I know that when I started looking into education just this last year, well, it's not even been a year ago, when I decided that I wanted to go back to school and teach, I didn't consider special education. I knew that I did not want to do high school or middle school. Having subbed in those, I'll leave the teenagers to someone else. I did really enjoy elementary though, so that's what I set my major to. Having worked as a parent now a little over a year with a lot of children that have special needs in some form or another, I've really enjoyed making those connections with them and building those relationships and seeing their growth. So I might consider, right now I'm going to keep my major at elementary, but I might consider adding a special education minor. And I think with the research I've done on that, there's going to be a need for highly qualified teachers in the special education field in the near future, and certainly in the long-term future. So I think that is it for my presentation. Thank you.